March 23rd, 1998.
Oh my God!
Hollywood loves winners.
This might be the one time I'm speechless.
And the Oscar goes to Jack Nicholson in As Good as It Gets.
I don't know about you, but I'm having a really great time.
So when this Oscar-winning actor and the director of Fatal Attraction took on a classic, you might think Hollywood would love it.
A normal man, given a group photograph of schoolgirls and asked to point out the loveliest one, will not necessarily choose the nymphette among them.
That's my low.
Beautiful.
But is it too explosive even for Hollywood? Tonight, Lolita. It may be the most controversial movie you'll never see.
From ABC News, this is Nightline. Substituting for Ted Koppel and reporting from Washington, Chris Wallace.
It was a night for big movies and big stars. Jack Nicholson won his third Oscar, Robin Williams won his first, and Titanic won 11, tying Ben-Hur from 1959 as the most honored movie ever. James Cameron, the driving force behind the $200 million production, accepted the Oscar.
There's no way that I can express to you what I'm feeling right now. My heart is full to bursting, except to say, I'm the king of the world!
But on this night of big winners, we want to focus on some losers. And we don't mean people in the audience who didn't get their names called. No, we mean the people who have made a film of Vladimir Nabokov's classic, Lolita, the story of a man's sexual obsession with a 12-year-old girl. The movie was completed a year ago. It stars Jeremy Irons and cost more than $50 million to make. But one major distributor after another has refused to release it. And there's a chance now it may not be shown in this country. Hollywood isn't known for its good taste. They produce movies about anything they think will make money. In fact, in 1962, they made an earlier version of Lolita. So why now is this subject over the line? In a few moments, we'll talk with Jeremy Irons. But first, more about the movie you may never see. From Nightline's John Donvan.
Search the shelves of any good bookstore these days for the novel Lolita, and sometimes you'll still find copies emblazoned with a boast. Soon to be a major motion picture.
Take 4. Action!
Well, the motion picture did get made. The project was completed in 1997. But is it major?
These are my lilies.
Can you call a film major when long after they've put the trailer together, the number of theaters that have shown it in the United States is exactly 0?
From Vladimir Nabokov's controversial masterpiece.
Is it major when a film that cost $50 million to make has sold not a single ticket in the United States? Or when a major star like Jeremy Irons, who won a Best Actor Oscar for Reversal of Fortune, teams up with a major director like Adrian Lyne, who made himself famous and lots of people rich directing films like Flashdance and Fatal Attraction and 9½ Weeks. And yet you may not even have heard that Irons and Lyne had made a new Lolita. You might conclude that this must be one bad movie. But among the critics who have reviewed it, no one's using that word. Far from it.
It's an eminently releasable movie. The young woman playing Lolita, I think, really does a fantastic piece of acting.
This film looks fantastic on screen. I think this is one of the best films I've seen all year.
Well, if the acting is so fantastic and if the production looks so good, then what is it about this movie? Why isn't it playing right now at a multiplex near you? Or at the very least, why isn't it showing at an art house in the nearest big city? Could it be something about the story? When Lolita the novel was published in the mid-1950s, its author, the Russian-born master of English, Vladimir Nabokov, was said by fellow writer Graham Greene to have written one of the most important books of the 20th century. It is still taught today in college literature courses, except there was a problem getting it published.
Nabokov sent the manuscript around to 4 different publishing houses in the United States, all of whom refused to publish the text.
The problem, or at least a problem, wrote Nabokov, was that Lolita takes its readers into the mind of a middle-aged man named Humbert Humbert, played by Irons in the new film, who becomes sexually obsessed with a 12-year-old girl named Lolita and eventually has sex with her. It is the language of Lolita the novel that marked it as a masterpiece. The film is quite faithful to Nabokov's text.
My sin, my soul.
But language or no language, the story was considered so controversial that Nabokov had to send the manuscript to Paris to get it published. When he did find an American publisher in 1958, it was still considered scandalous. In 1962, director Stanley Kubrick helped bring Lolita into the popular mainstream with a film version. And that story.
Voila! My yellow roses, my daughter.
But Kubrick, in fact, toned it all down. In his version, Humbert and Lolita never kiss. But he was faithful to Nabokov's ending. Everyone dies. Which is why Nabokov's son, Dmitri, argues that Lolita in no way justifies what Humbert Humbert did with Lolita. Not in the book, not in the movie.
Lolita in itself has nothing pornographic about it. It is an eminently moral movie in which the two villains get their just and strong comeuppance in the end.
But when Entertainment Weekly dismisses the new Lolita as borderline pervy, when the British columnist William Oddie scorns the film by calling the Lolita story a dreary and poisonous tract for our misbegotten times, when protesters picket the film's premiere in Germany because they say it tries to legitimize sex with children, some people suspect that the story is why the film has been shunned by Hollywood's distributors.
When somebody uses the word pedophilia or child abuse, I think people get very, very nervous.
The welcome for Lolita, the film the whole town's talking about.
An interesting paradox. In the supposedly more repressed 1950s, Nabokov's Lolita can be published. In the 60s, Kubrick's Lolita can be released. In the 70s, movies can be made that feature child prostitutes. There was Pretty Baby.
Want to make it like this?
There was Taxi Driver. But in the 90s, the new Lolita cannot get a screening. Now, is that because, after all these years and all the real-life stories we've heard about child abuse, that Hollywood has finally become sensitive to the issue, too sensitive for the makers of Lolita? Nonsense, says film critic Michael Medved. This isn't about morality, it's about money.
Look, Hollywood is scared off about the sexuality in this film only in one sense. They're not worried about protests, they're worried about failure. Every cutting-edge film recently that has tried to be cutting-edge about sexuality has been a big flop.
In fact, some critics believe the real problem with this Lolita is not that it's oversexed, it's that the sex is not explicit enough to sell tickets.
It is an art movie. I mean, it's shot that way, it looks that way. It's a very earnest, sober adaptation of what is, after all, one of the great classics of modernist literature.
Line's Lolita, in other words, may be too respectable to make a lot of money. Certainly not as much as some of his other films.
I think going in, everyone expected Adrian Lyne to do 9.5 weeks with a 12-year-old, and that's not what it is. And that's what makes it an ambitious film, and that's what makes it a marketing nightmare.
And a financial one as well. At a cost of $50 million to produce, this film probably will never turn a profit, despite healthy runs in Italy, France, Germany, and this week Russia. In some of those places, there have been calls for banning the new Lolita. In this country, no one's had to. This is John Donvan for Nightline.
And when we come back, a conversation we had earlier today with the star of Lolita, Jeremy Irons, and its director, Adrian Lyne.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by AT&T.
Oscar-winning actor Jeremy Irons is on movie screens all over America these days in The Man in the Iron Mask. But you may never see him as Humbert Humbert in the new version of Lolita. He's with us from Santa Monica, California. As is the director of Lolita, Adrian Lyne, who was nominated for an Oscar for Fatal Attraction. His credits also include Flashdance, 9.5 Weeks, and Indecent Proposal. Mr. Irons, Hollywood releases movies about all kinds of distasteful subjects, including cannibalism and necrophilia. Given that, why do you think they won't touch Lolita?
I think it's the political climate in this country at the moment, sadly. There seems to be a certain part of the community who have almost become more puritanical than they were 20 years ago. And I think the studios are nervous of upsetting them. In other words, I think they're being bullied by a minority, which is sad.
Mr. Line, you have said that the Hollywood studios are not showing moral courage in rejecting this film. How so?
I think a lot has changed in the last 5 or 6 years. I think this movie would have come out in the 80s. I know it would have come out in the 70s. As somebody said earlier on, I think maybe Martin Scorsese would have great trouble making Taxi Driver now. I think a lot has changed.
But Mr. Lyons, one of the other things that's changed is things like the John Benet Ramsey murder case, the pedophile child murders in Belgium.
Yes.
Is it a wave of puritanicalism, or is it in fact that people are more sensitive to what in fact is criminal behavior?
Well, I think, you know, we're making a movie of a classic novel, a novel that is taught in schools and universities all over the world. It obviously involves pedophilia, but this novel is so much more. It's you read it and you're appalled by what happens, but it's hilariously funny. And it's ultimately a love story. And the idea that I wouldn't be able to touch this subject or shouldn't touch this subject and have to sweep it under the carpet seems kind of sinister. I think that only good can come out of airing a problem, and so plays and movies that involve contentious subjects should be able to be made. It's outrageous that they can't.
But let me ask you about that, Mr. Line. You say only good can come of it. One of the problems may be for some people that you are such a good filmmaker. You make such wonderful images. One of the first times in the movie, I believe it's the first time that Mr. Irons' character, Humbert, sees Lolita. She's reading, lying on the grass with a sprinkler matting down her and drenching her dress. I mean, aren't you in fact making a little girl an object of sexual desire just by the images on the film?
Well, I mean, the truth is that Humbert in the novel is attracted to what Nabokov calls nymphets. I mean, this is true. And somebody said to me, "Are you going to make the sexuality in the movie erotic?" And it was a really good question, I think. And I thought a long while about it and understood that I had to, because the movie is being seen through Humbert's eyes, so I had to.
But Mr. Irons, don't changing times force changing images? In the 1930s, blacks were being portrayed as step and fetch it, which obviously was offensive and absolutely unacceptable years later. Can it be that changing times have forced us to look differently at the idea of nymphets?
I think we're living in a dream world if we don't believe that that young children growing up, children in their teens, are not attractive things. They are. I think as parents we know that our children go through a wonderful blooming. That is how they are. We have laid down a society whereby it is illegal to have sexual relations with a child below a certain age. That age is different in different countries and different states within America. And that is absolutely right. Children must be guarded. Their childhood must be protected. We must wait until they are emotionally old enough to have physical relations. That, I think, doesn't need saying. I think any sane, mature person will believe that. However, I think one of the objects of drama, of stories, film, novels, whatever, is to show people what can happen if you go wrong. A great play the Greeks wrote called Oedipus, where a man makes love to his mother unknowingly, has always been a great piece of work. Titus Andronicus of Shakespeare, a man eats his mother. Now, we aren't saying that this is how we should behave. We're saying this is what can happen in life. This is the seed of drama. And Nabokov is writing a tragic love affair a story where those people who go wrong, who go over the limits of what is acceptable in society, get their comeuppance. It's a fable, it's a tragic tale, and I believe therefore very moral. And if we are to understand each other as human beings, we surely must be able to see behavior or read about behavior where people take the wrong steps, go the wrong way in life, and see what the outcome is. That is part of what storytelling, surely in our society, should do.
Gentlemen, we have to pause here, but when we return, I want to ask you both about money, which is always a big part of the equation in Hollywood. And we'll be back in a moment. And we're back again with actor Jeremy Irons and the director of Lolita, Adrian Lyne. Mr. Lyne, some people in Hollywood say that one of the problems is that you made an art house movie with a very limited audience on a major motion picture budget of $50 million. From a financial point of view, did this movie ever make sense?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's of interest that when I showed the movie last week at the DGA, the Directors Guild, my union, when in fact Richard Schickel saw the movie, over 500 people were turned away. And that hasn't happened to me on any other movie that I've done. I think there's huge interest in this piece.
Mr. Irons, I understand that for a long time you turned down this project. How come?
I did, but I'd like to just to answer your last question and remind you that you say $50 million, a huge budget. The average cost of a studio movie these days is $58 million, so we are below average. It's not that expensive. Yes, to go back to your question, I thought long and hard about playing Humbert Humbert because I felt I had played many characters who explored extremes of behavior which were socially unacceptable. And purely for my career, I thought maybe I'll steer away from that for a little while. But then three things persuaded me. First of all, it is a classic novel of this century. It's a very complicated character, complex character, with a director who was passionate to make it. And those are three things that make an actor want to do something.
I would like to add one thing, if I may. I think one of the things that people find troubling about the movie is that Jeremy's performance is really in shades of gray. They would be much happier, much more comfortable, I think, if they could just hate this man, just see him in black and white terms. And you know, what's extraordinary, I think, about Jeremy's performance is that we understand what he's doing is hateful. We are appalled by what he's doing. But then in the next breath, we are amused by the man, and we feel sorry for the man. And at the end of this movie, when Humbert sees Lolita pregnant and polluted, as Nabokov says, with another man's child, we understand that he really does love her. And in the end, and I think this is very important, and Nabokov meant us to understand this, in the end, I think that Jeremy Irons' character, Humbert Humbert, has a certain redemption. You understand that if Lolita had wanted him at the end, he would have stayed with her. He would not have chased around after nymphettes of 12, and I think he would have stayed with her even though she is now no longer what he adored, which was a nymphette.
Mr. Lyne, we talk about changing times. One of the problems that you faced is something called the 1996 Child Pornography Prevention Act, which not only makes it a crime to depict minors, but even to appear to depict minors, children, in sexually explicit conduct. Did you have a lawyer on the set with you so you could work your way through those shoals?
Well, I sat for 6 weeks with an attorney in the cutting room because essentially I could not use any of the shots that I had done with the body double because you weren't allowed, an adult wasn't allowed to imitate or pretend to be a minor. And this was actually aimed at the internet. It was aimed at computers, really, where I think people were putting children's heads on mature bodies. And it spilled over into films and plays.
Isn't the important thing, if I can cut in, to say to say, why is a piece of work being done? Why is it being made? Did Nabokov write Lolita in order to encourage people to have sex with underage children? Did Adrian Lyne make the film in order to encourage people to do that? Or was there another motive?
Mr. Irons, knowing all the problems that this film has had, if you had it to do all over again, would you?
I think it's the duty of artists, of writers, of actors to face difficult issues, to face taboos. If I was involved in an industry which was turning out purely feel-good fantasy movies that just made everybody feel lovely and gave them a nice time, I don't think I could stay in the business. I think we should address thorny problems, and we should try to broaden people's perceptions of the human condition.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Adrian Lyne, Jeremy Irons, we want to thank you both very much for joining us tonight.
Pleasure.
And I'll be back with a program note in a moment. Tomorrow on Good Morning America, a conversation with tonight's Oscar winners. And tomorrow on Nightline, crime and punishment. Ted Koppel begins a series of reports from Texas on a state-of-the-art high-tech prison for the most incorrigible. And that's our report for tonight. I'm Chris Wallace in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
If you'd like a transcript or video cassette of this or any other edition of Nightline, please dial 1-800-CALL-ABC. Nightline is always on with abcnews.com, on the web or AOL.
Nightline has been a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source. ABC News, now always on.